Hey, so I want to talk to you about drafting your street art analysis. And I'm working from the assumption that you've already done the three things depicted on this PowerPoint slide. You've chosen the art and put it on our street art roster. You visited and photographed the art, so you have the material you need to analyze. And you've done some library and web research to find resources to help your reader/viewer of art better understand it. With those things under your belt, it's time to draft. Woohoo! Now, what I recommend is creating your Google Doc and starting first by putting your photo or photos in there. Let's take a look at what that might look like by looking at the sample street art analysis. So here we can see that I have inserted a nice large image of the Death of a Farm Worker mural. It's important that it's there. I can see it while I'm writing about it. My viewers can see it while they're reading about it. I also include photographic evidence that I did my field work, that I went to Barrio Logan, that I went to Chicano Park, and I looked at the murals. So that's what I mean by putting in the photos. And that's the first thing you want to do once you've created your Google Doc. And we can again see here that I'm working in Google Doc, and there's a link with instructions about how to create Google Docs, and you've already done that once to do your draft work, annotated works cited. So once you've got your photo in there, it's time to write a paragraph, and your paragraph is going to have three elements. You're going to have a claim that answers the guiding question, what does this work of street art say about the tension between X and Y in American culture? Then you're going to identify specific details from the work of art and interpret those details, which means explain how they support your claim. As you do that, you're going to discuss at least one, but any relevant cultural contexts for that work of art. That would be events, names, ideas, values, beliefs, practices that were part of the culture either at the time it was created or at the time you're viewing it, or maybe some mix of both. But cultural context is an important part of our discussion. If you notice, these things you're being asked to do in the paragraph match up with our course objectives. So let's look at the three required elements one at a time. And for each element, we'll look at what I'm looking for, and then we'll bounce over to the sample to see what it looks like. So your claim is going to be your very first sentence, and it's going to answer the guiding question, what does the work of art tell us about the tension between blank and blank in American culture? You should pick this tension from our American cultural tensions list. For this project, no making up new tensions. You work with one of the ones on that list. And remember, a tension is two terms, and we're going to use both terms in our claim. Our claim also should identify the work, the title of the work, and the date that it was created to the best of your research knowledge. Remember, your claim's going to answer the question, not repeat it. So we're not going to say things like, this statue displays the tension. That just repeats the question, right? Well, what does display mean? No, what does it say about this tension? So this statue honors racial equality and critiques racial hierarchy. Or this statue endorses this value and questions this value. Or this statue attempts to balance the American desire for individualism with the American desire for communalism. That kind of thing where you're kind of stating how the work of art comments on the tension. You're not just telling us the tension is there. We know the tension is there. That's why you're saying something about it. What we want to know is what the work of art says about the tension. Let's go back to the sample and look at the claim for that. So here in the sample analysis, we can look at the very first sentence, and that is our claim. And you're going to notice that it dates it, 1979. It gives us the title, Death of a Farm Worker. There's even a link where you can learn more about it. And then it uses the exact words from the tension. Celebrates the dignity and liberating power, work as liberating, even as it dramatically denounces mistreatment of farm workers in the ways that their work constrains, work is constrained, dehumanizing, even destroys them. So there it is. The tension is work is liberating, work is constraining. Both words, both exact terms from the tension are in the sentence, but notice how the sentence doesn't just say the tension's there, doesn't say the tension exists. It tells us what the mural says about the tension. It could have said it tries to balance these two values. It could have said that it promotes these values, endorses these values, undercuts them, criticizes them. But what happens in this mural is a little of both. One idea is being celebrated, the other is being critiqued. And that's an example of a strong claim sentence. Don't forget to come back and look at this again as you're working on your own, if that would be helpful for you. So again, that's what a claim should look like, and those are our criteria. Now let's go on to the second thing you need to do. Once you've made a claim, you need to support that claim. You need to bring in evidence that supports that claim, and you need to explain that evidence. How do these details I'm mentioning support what I'm saying in my claim? So if I have said that a statue attempts to balance individualism and communalism, I need to show details that promote or suggest individualism, and I need to talk about details that show communalism and talk about how those details express the statue's argument, so to speak, social comment that both of these details should be valorized. Or if I see the statue as critiquing one value and celebrating another, or endorsing one, or whatever, I'm going to pick out the details that do that and show the reader where that is. So it's not just identifying details, it's interpreting and explaining them. Let's go back to the sample and see where that happens. So we move to our first piece of evidence, which is the quote from Emiliano Zapata. So this is a sentence that tells us about the quote, and it's followed by a sentence that, actually two sentences, that interpret the quote. So I've got a claim in my first sentence, then I present carefully and fully a piece of evidence, I identify a detail from the mural, then I interpret, explain what that detail means and how it connects back to the tension. Notice how I'm echoing some of the language of the tension. There's liberates in there. It's going to be necessary to use echo language like that to make the connection back to the claim. And especially when you're drafting, don't worry about repetitive language. Worry about clarity first. We can clean up the repetitive stuff and look for synonyms later. Okay, so that's one example of identifying and interpreting details. Let's look for another one. We go down the mural and we talk about images that are associated with protest and mistreatment. So there's a man lying in a coffin, there's a mechanized factory cog, and there's workers protesting. So those are the details. Notice how I identify them. But for every detail you present, you also need to also present an interpretation. So I need to elaborate a little bit, and that's why there's this nice sentence here that say these details point to the destructive and there it is again, constraining role. So that's what we want to be doing. Here's some details that I think are interesting and important to my claim. Here's why. Here's what they mean. That's the way we're going. And if you notice when I'm presenting the details, I'm also kind of interpreting them already as we go along, right? Some of that language in these sentences that present the details are also interpreting them. Let's look at one more. There's a comment here about the final two panels of the mural and what's in them. And then there is a sentence interpreting that. All right. So that's kind of how we want to think about our details. We present them, we interpret them. We present them and interpret them. We don't want to list a bunch of details and then just have one sentence interpreting them. As we present each detail or each related cluster of details, we want to interpret that cluster, explain to our reader how that supports our claim. So once we've made our claim and backed it up with details and interpretation of those details, now we can move into context. Now, I said that as if it's a separate thing, but actually context can appear anywhere in your analytical paragraph. And if you'll notice the sample I've given you, it actually appears in multiple places. But what we want to do is explain to readers the relationship between the context we're sharing and what we are saying in our claim. So if you look at my sample analysis paragraph, you'll see that most of the context relates to the United Farm Workers Revolution, but there are some other things in the United Farm Workers Movement. There are some other things. For example, Emiliano Zapata is the source for the quote in the mural. He was a Mexican revolutionary, and I have a link to a site, to a database, a MiraCosta database article. So that's a high quality source, meets highest academic and professional criteria because it's in a library database. So there's an example of where my research and my context work in a post come together. I'm explaining something in the mural that requires me to talk about a context. So that's a good example of the kind of context work you might want to do in your analytical paragraph. I also talk about the United Farm Workers Movement, again, because it's depicted in the mural. There's a protest scene. You can see it right there in the mural. And so I talk about that element in the mural, and I need to contextualize that because a reader needs to understand where are those Thunderbirds coming from? Who are these protesting workers? So again, I have a link to a library database article about the United Farm Workers Movement. So I'm mentioning things and resourcing them. Oh, look at that typo. Look at that. You get to watch me fix a typo. There we go. Mural's only one L. All right. Finally, if you remember from what I said in my previous PowerPoint slide, a big part of contextualizing, though, is making the connection for the reader. So you're not just randomly throwing in a cultural context. You're explaining to the reader how it supports your claim. And I do that in the final sentences here when I talk about the United Farm Workers and the political agenda of the mural and what that says to the Latino residents of Barrio Logan. And so that's where I really explain and fully interpret the context information and connect it back to the claim sentences argument about work as simultaneously destructive and liberating and empowering. So you can see that not only am I doing the cultural background work that my reader needs to understand this work of art by telling my reader who Zapata is and giving some background on the United Farm Workers, I'm also using some sentences in my analysis to explain the meaning of this context and how it fits in with the claim that I'm making. So there you have it, my guided tour of the 3 things that you need to do. State a claim, identify and interpret details from the work of art, and contextualize the piece, informing the reader of background information she or he might need to know, and situating the work of art either in the time when it was created or in our current context where you're viewing it. Okay, now it's your turn. Get out there and work on it. I encourage you to return to the sample and keep coming back to this video lecture. I've also made the slideshow available for you separately, so if you just want to work through the PowerPoint to remind yourself, you can do that too. See you in Blackboard. Thanks for your time and attention to this much longer than usual lecture.